A store run that changed everything. 15 minutes. That's all it should have taken Kristy Wesselman to walk to the store and back. 15 minutes that turned into 30 years of mystery. A sunny afternoon in Glen Ellen, Illinois, seemed like any other. Kristy Wesselman, just 15, decided to head out for a quick trip to the local store. It was a routine errand, a soda and a chocolate bar for herself and her mom. She'd made this walk so many times before that it felt almost automatic. Her mother, watching her leave, didn't feel even a flicker of worry. The store was close, the neighborhood safe. What could possibly go wrong? But as minutes turned into hours, unease began to grip the household. Kristy's mother, initially brushing off the delay as a teenager's whim to chat with friends or linger, began calling around. One by one, her friends denied seeing her. The cheerful streets, once so familiar and inviting, now carried an eerie weight. As the sun dipped below the horizon, an unsettling reality began to settle in. Something was wrong. Very wrong. By midnight, the neighborhood was alive with concern. Friends, family, and neighbors searched every corner of the quiet streets, their flashlights casting nervous beams into the dark. Shadows that once held no meaning now seemed to whisper fears they dared not voice. It wasn't until 1:50 a.m., with her mother's hands trembling, that the police were finally called. Officers arrived quickly, piecing together Kristy's last known movements. At the store, the clerk confirmed she had stopped by, her usual cheerful self. She had bought her snacks and left, not a trace of worry on her face. That was the last moment anyone saw her. How could a young girl vanish so completely, so suddenly? What happened in those few fleeting minutes between the store and her home? As the search continued into the night, a sense of dread settled over Glen Ellen. The town held its collective breath, waiting for the morning light to reveal what they feared the most. The morning brings horror. As dawn broke over Glen Ellen, the town stirred with a shared determination, though a heavy sense of dread hung in the air. Neighbors joined the search, flashlights casting beams of light through the misty morning. Their voices called out Kristy's name, a fragile hope laced with growing fear. The police, now working tirelessly, examined every possible route Kristy might have taken on her way to the store. That's when one detective's focus shifted to a shortcut. A narrow, well-trodden path through a field that local children often use to save time. The field, overgrown with tall grass, moved gently in the breeze, an ordinary sight that concealed unimaginable darkness. As the officer pushed further into the overgrowth, his sharp eyes caught a glimpse of something that didn't belong. His breath stilled as he stepped closer, and then it hit him. A shape, a silence that told him everything. Hidden beneath the towering grass was the lifeless body of a young girl. Kristy. The discovery was devastating. Kristy's body bore the unmistakable signs of a brutal attack. 8 deep stab wounds, each one a testament to the unspeakable violence she had endured. The innocence of her youth, her vibrant energy had been extinguished in a moment of unimaginable cruelty. Forensic examiners arrived quickly, combing the scene for anything. A footprint, a strand of hair, a scrap of evidence, but the field seemed to yield no secrets. There were no footprints, no personal belongings, no trail to follow. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air. One detail, however, stood out. A pearl ring Kristy always wore was missing. Her mother later confirmed it was a cherished keepsake. Its absence felt chilling, almost deliberate, as if the murderer had taken it as a token of their heinous crime. The stark reality of the attack, combined with the utter lack of witnesses or evidence, turned the once peaceful neighborhood into a place of unease and fear. Questions plagued the minds of everyone involved. How could such brutality go unnoticed? How could someone commit such a horrific act and disappear without leaving so much as a whisper of their presence? For Kristy's family, these questions were unbearable. The community, once united in its safety and familiarity, now faced the bitter truth. There was a predator among them, and they had no idea who it could be. Who was capable of such savagery? And why Kristy? As the investigation began, these haunting questions loomed, refusing to let the town rest. The hunt for a ghost. The discovery of Kristy's body sent shockwaves through the quiet town, leaving neighbors shaken and desperate for answers. But the police had no time to dwell on the tragedy. They needed to act quickly. They retraced her steps, beginning with the store where she was last seen. The clerk, a familiar face who had known Kristy since she was little, confirmed she'd been there around 4 p.m., cheerful and carrying her snacks. She had left without a care in the world. That was the last anyone saw of her alive. The investigators widened their net, interviewing witnesses who had been in the area. Some had spotted Kristy walking, others had seen her at the store, but none had noticed anything unusual. The details were fragmented and frustratingly vague. Desperate for answers, the police turned their focus to the shortcut where Kristy's body was discovered. The narrow path, worn into the grass by countless feet, was a familiar route for local kids and residents heading to the nearby store. If the killer had taken her there, surely someone had seen something. But no one had. Even a family hosting a barbecue just a few dozen yards from the field recalled nothing suspicious. There had been no screams, no signs of a struggle. It was as if the killer had moved like a ghost, leaving no trace of their horrific act. Investigators began to consider the chilling possibility that Kristy might have known her attacker. In a small, close-knit town where most neighbors were familiar faces, this theory felt even more unsettling. The police pressed on, questioning everyone who might have crossed paths with Kristy that day. Friends, neighbors, and distant acquaintances were all interviewed. Men with histories of violence were scrutinized, their alibis checked and rechecked, but no one stood out. One by one, suspects were cleared, and the trail grew colder. For Kristy's mother, the lack of answers was unbearable. Every night she clung to the hope that someone, somewhere, had seen something, anything that could break open the case. But as days turned into weeks, every lead fizzled into nothing. The silence was deafening, the mystery unrelenting. Who could have committed such a savage act and slipped away without leaving so much as a whisper behind? Was the killer someone they passed every day? Someone hiding in plain sight? The town, once safe and serene, now held its breath, waiting for answers that felt impossibly out of reach. A town gripped by fear and frustration. Weeks passed, and the once tranquil streets of Glen Ellen grew heavy with unease. Parents kept their children close, their eyes scanning every stranger with suspicion. The image of Kristy Wesselman, her bright smile and youthful energy, was now etched into every conversation, a haunting reminder of the horrific violence that had shattered the town's peace. The police, though relentless in their efforts, began to hit dead ends. Every suspect they brought in failed to connect to the crime. Among them was Dana Henry, a local man whose initial refusal to provide a DNA sample raised suspicion. The authorities zeroed in on him, pushing him to the brink. Days spent in a jail cell stripped of his dignity finally broke him. Reluctantly, he gave his DNA, and the results proved his innocence. But the damage was already done. Dana's life spiraled into chaos. He lost his job, his home, and the trust of those who once stood by him. For many, his name was forever tied to suspicion, and no amount of evidence could erase that stain. Anger simmered beneath his frustration, but the apology he deserved never came. The system had failed him, just as it had failed Kristy. For Kristy's family, the torment was relentless. Her mother, once a vibrant member of the community, was now a shadow of her former self. Haunted by endless questions, she replayed Kristy's final moments in her mind, searching for answers that refused to come. Why her daughter? Why that day? And how could someone commit such a monstrous act and vanish without a trace? Despite the police's efforts, the case grew colder with each passing month. Leads dried up, and the shadow of uncertainty loomed over the town. Glen Ellen, once a safe and familiar haven, now felt like a place under siege. A predator had walked among them, and the silence of the unsolved case became deafening. As the seasons changed, so did the town. The shortcut where Kristy's body had been found became a path no one wanted to take. Families locked their doors earlier, and the carefree spirit of the community faded. Would justice ever find its way to Glen Ellen? Or would Kristy's murder remain an open wound, a chilling reminder of how quickly safety could be torn away? The breakthrough that took decades. For 3 painful years, Kristy's murder lingered in limbo, a haunting shadow over Glen Ellen. The case grew colder with each passing day, but her family refused to let go of hope. They clung to the belief that justice would come, even as the unanswered questions deepened their wounds. Investigators, though determined, found themselves at a dead end. Every lead fizzled out, and theories began to run thin. It seemed the killer had slipped away, leaving nothing but pain behind. In 1988, a faint glimmer of hope broke through the darkness. A new tool, DNA analysis, had begun to reshape criminal investigations. Though the technology was still in its infancy, it promised a way to solve cases that had once seemed unsolvable. Kristy's case was revisited, and the biological evidence collected from the crime scene was preserved for future testing. It was a fragile hope, but it was all they had. Maybe the killer had left behind the one thing he couldn't hide, his DNA. The police began gathering DNA samples from everyone who had ever been considered a suspect. Men with prior convictions, those who had lived in the area, and anyone even remotely connected to the case were asked to cooperate. Most complied, and one by one, their samples ruled them out. But Dana Henry, a man who had already endured suspicion, initially refused. His refusal reignited doubts, sparking a tense legal standoff. Under immense pressure and desperate to clear his name, Dana finally agreed to provide his DNA. Once again, he was exonerated. His DNA did not match the evidence from the crime scene. Though proven innocent a second time, the ordeal left his life in ruins. Dana's anger and frustration were justified. He had lost his job, his home, and his peace of mind. And yet, despite the proof of his innocence, whispers of doubt continued to follow him. For years, the DNA evidence sat untouched, waiting for technology to catch up with the truth. Then, in 2002, Illinois enacted a law requiring DNA samples from criminal suspects, a game-changer in cases like Kristy's. The preserved evidence remained a silent witness, ready for the day it could speak. That day finally came in 2015. A match was found. The DNA collected from Kristy's crime scene was linked to a man named Michael Jones, a 62-year-old living in Champaign, Illinois. Jones's DNA had been entered into the database after he was arrested for domestic violence. The revelation was shocking. Jones had never been a suspect, never even crossed the investigators' radar. Who was Michael Jones? And how had he managed to evade justice for so long? The discovery was just the beginning, peeling back the layers of a story far darker and more sinister than anyone could have imagined. The face of a monster. Michael Jones was a name that had never surfaced during the investigation, a man who had lived in the shadows of the case for decades. Yet his DNA was the undeniable link to Kristy Wesselman's murder. As investigators began to piece together his past, they uncovered a chilling portrait of a predator who had long escaped justice. Jones, now 62 years old and living in Champaign, Illinois, carried a violent history that stretched back decades. In the mid-1970s, he assaulted a woman, leaving her deeply traumatized. Just a year later, his crimes escalated when he attacked another woman, abandoning her in a hospital parking lot after a brutal assault. Despite the severity of these crimes, Jones managed to avoid serious consequences. He played the system, expressing regret and blaming mental health struggles during his trial. The courts showed leniency, and he walked free far too soon. The system's failure to hold him accountable allowed him to continue his violence, unchecked and undeterred. By 1983, Jones had served only 6 years of a 10 to 20-year sentence for his earlier crimes. He was released despite his history and resumed his life as if nothing had happened. 2 years later, in 1985, his path crossed with Kristy's. Investigators now believe that Jones, a frequent traveler on his motorcycle, was passing through Glen Ellen that day, using one of his many solitary trips to remain unnoticed. His transient lifestyle, combined with his calculated actions, made him nearly invisible. A predator perfectly suited to slip through the cracks. The warning signs in his life were abundant. In 1994, Jones's first wife left him, citing his disturbing obsession with a young relative. Though she secured a restraining order, no formal charges were filed. Then, in 1999, Jones assaulted a family member of his new girlfriend, once again escaping significant punishment. It wasn't until 2015, when his wife reported him for domestic violence, that his DNA entered the national database, finally revealing his connection to Kristy's murder. What made Jones particularly haunting was his ability to evade detection. He wasn't a local in Glen Ellen. He left no obvious trail and had no known ties to the town. His ability to blend in, to move quietly between towns and states, kept him off the radar for decades. He was the kind of predator that communities fear most, an unknown face hiding in plain sight. The question that lingered was, why Kristy? Was it chance, a brief and fleeting opportunity, or had he been watching her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? The truth of that day lay buried in Jones's twisted mind, but his cold, calculated demeanor offered no answers. All that remained was the stark reality of a young life stolen and a killer who had roamed free for far too long. Michael Jones had finally been exposed, but the damage he had inflicted, the lives he had devastated, served as a harsh reminder of the system's failures. Justice had come, but it was far too late for Kristy and her family. Justice, delayed but not denied. In September 2015, Michael Jones was arrested, bringing an end to the 30-year-long mystery that had haunted Glen Ellen and devastated Kristy Wesselman's family. The undeniable DNA match made it clear that the man who had evaded justice for decades had finally been caught. For the Wesselman family, the news brought a bittersweet sense of relief. The monster responsible for Kristy's brutal murder would face justice, but the weight of 3 lost decades hung heavy on their hearts. The question they couldn't escape was why it had taken so long. How had a man like Jones, with such a violent history, been allowed to roam free for years? When Jones was brought in for questioning, his demeanor was chillingly emotionless. He denied any involvement, even as investigators presented the irrefutable DNA evidence. His calmness, his refusal to admit guilt, only added to the horror of his crimes. Those who had known him painted a picture of a man with a volatile temper, capable of exploding in anger without warning. An ex-girlfriend described him as deeply fascinated by crime novels and detective shows, an unsettling hobby that seemed like practice for someone who had learned to cover his tracks. Jones's arrest set the wheels of justice into motion, but the process was painfully slow. It wasn't until 2018, 3 years after his arrest, that his case finally went to trial. The Wesselman family endured every agonizing delay, holding on to the hope that this time they would see justice for Kristy. Prosecutors sought a life sentence, determined to ensure that Jones could never harm anyone else. His violent past, his unrepentant demeanor, and the horror of Kristy's murder painted a picture of a man who belonged behind bars forever. Then came an unexpected turn. Michael Jones pleaded guilty, sparing the family the torment of a drawn-out trial. While the guilty plea provided relief, it also came with a heartbreaking cost. In exchange for his plea, Jones wasn't required to reveal the details of Kristy's final moments. Her family would never know exactly what happened that day in the field, a void that no amount of justice could fill. The ache of those unanswered questions would remain with them forever. The judge handed Jones an 80-year sentence, ensuring he would never see freedom again. For Kristy's mother, the moment was bittersweet. She thanked the investigators who had worked tirelessly to solve the case but couldn't suppress her anger at the system's failures. If he had served his full sentence for his earlier crimes, she said, her voice shaking with emotion, Kristy would still be alive. The system failed my daughter. It failed us all. In the courtroom, Dana Henry sat quietly. The man who had once been wrongfully accused of Kristy's murder watched as Jones was finally held accountable. But for Dana, the moment brought little solace. The years of suspicion, the damage to his reputation, and the silence from those who had wronged him had left scars that would never heal. No one apologized, he said later. No one tried to make it right. My life was destroyed, and no one cared. Jones showed no remorse as the sentence was handed down. The man who had stolen a young girl's life and evaded justice for decades remained stoic, his face betraying no emotion. For Kristy's family, the sentence brought some closure, but it couldn't erase the pain of knowing that Jones had lived freely for so long, unchecked and unrepentant. The trial and conviction marked the end of a legal battle, but the emotional fallout continued to ripple through Glen Ellen. Kristy's murder had forever changed the community, shattering its sense of safety and leaving wounds that would never fully heal. Justice had come, but it had arrived far too late, the echoes of a tragedy. Michael Jones's conviction finally brought a legal end to the long and painful journey of Kristy Wesselman's case, but the emotional scars stretched far beyond the courtroom. For 3 decades, the unresolved murder had cast a shadow over her family, friends, and the entire Glen Ellen community. The truth had come to light, but the wounds it left were as raw as ever. Kristy's mother, once an active and optimistic presence in the town, had spent those years weighed down by grief and unanswered questions. For her, the news of Jones's arrest and conviction was bittersweet. Relief that her daughter's killer had been caught mixed with a deep anger over the years lost to silence. She often replayed Kristy's final moments in her mind, haunted by the thought of what she had endured. Why did it take so long? She asked, her voice heavy with frustration. She couldn't help but wonder how many lives had been shattered because the system allowed a man like Jones to remain free. In Glen Ellen, time had moved forward, but the shadow of Kristy's death never truly lifted. The shortcut through the field where her body was found, a path once filled with the laughter of children, had become a place of eerie stillness. Parents no longer allowed their children to roam freely, and the sense of security the town had once cherished was gone. Kristy's murder had stripped away the innocence of the community, leaving behind an ever-present sense of vulnerability. Dana Henry's story served as a reminder of the collateral damage caused by investigative missteps. Although DNA evidence eventually cleared him, the cloud of suspicion had permanently altered his life. His reputation was tarnished, his relationships strained, and his trust in the justice system shattered. Even as he sat in the courtroom during Jones's sentencing, watching justice finally be served, there was no sense of satisfaction. No one ever apologized, he said quietly in an interview. No one even tried to make it right. The scars left by those accusations stayed with him, a constant reminder of the system's failures. As for Michael Jones, he showed no remorse. The man who had eluded justice for decades remained stoic as the judge handed down an 80-year sentence, ensuring he would never walk free again. For Kristy's family, it was a small measure of justice, but it could never erase the decades of pain or bring back the life he had stolen. The knowledge that Jones had lived freely for so long, unchecked and unrepentant, only deepened their heartbreak. Kristy's mother put it simply, "The system failed my daughter. It failed us all." In the years since the case's resolution, Kristy's story has taken on a new meaning. Advances in DNA technology had finally delivered justice, proving that determination and innovation could triumph over time. But the case also exposed the cracks in the justice system, the early release of violent offenders, the mishandling of suspects, and the unnecessary anguish suffered by so many. These were failures that could not be undone, but could serve as lessons for the future. Today, Kristy's memory lives on as a symbol of both heartbreak and resilience. Her family's unwavering fight for answers ensured she was never forgotten. The investigators who refused to give up proved that even the coldest cases could still find resolution. And her story continues to inspire communities to demand accountability and change. But as we reflect on Kristy's case, the question remains: how many other victims, just like her, are still waiting for justice? How many families continue to live with unanswered questions, their loved ones' stories buried in the cold files of time? What steps can be taken to ensure no family has to endure the same heartbreak, and no innocent person suffers under the weight of wrongful suspicion? These answers won't come easily, but Kristy's story proves one undeniable truth: justice, though delayed, is still possible. Her legacy reminds us of the importance of perseverance and the need for a system that prioritizes the safety and dignity of every individual. Thank you for watching. If Kristy's story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Together, we can keep stories like Kristy's alive and push for the change that's needed to ensure justice for all.